You're listening to the Joe and Rosa Show, proclaiming the gospel through word and through song.
Hi, and welcome to the Joe and Rosa Show. I'm Joe.
And I'm Rosa.
And with us today we have Rachel Dawn, the author of Now What? How are you doing today, Rachel?
I'm very good. It's a gorgeous day here in Cincinnati.
Okay, Rachel Dawn, thank you so much for being on the Joe and Rosa Show. So your book is called Now What? Can you describe the moment where the title of your book actually came from?
Absolutely. So the subtitle of my book is A Story of Broken Dreams and the God Who Restores Them. And so the title is literally the phrase that I was, and the question that I was asking over and over during this season of my life when I went through my divorce. So I was fresh off my divorce, and what I thought God had been calling to, all the way since back in high school, I thought he was calling me to speak and teach and train and write books to young girls about abstinence. And that was the plan that I followed. I saved myself from marriage, and then, 4 years later, I find myself divorced. And so I literally, with my hands up out loud, was saying, okay, God, now what? Now what am I supposed to do with my life? Because I followed that plan, and that didn't work out for me. So, who else would want to follow that plan? And, what credibility would I have in teaching that idea? And I don't even know if I believe that anymore. And, what the heck am I supposed to do with my life now if that's not it? So that was, that title, Now What, was literally my heart cry during that season of my life.
Absolutely. I can understand that firsthand, as I actually found myself divorced at the age of 25. So when you're that young, some people haven't even gotten married and you're already married, divorced. I totally understand that. And so why was failure the biggest thing that you felt after this divorce rather than loneliness or heartbreak?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And it's interesting because that was something I didn't even understand myself. So, when you go through a divorce, and you've been there, so you can probably relate to this. Of course there's heartbreak. Of course there's loneliness, and there's all these other emotions. But the word that was loudest on a loop in my head was failure. And it was, my marriage failed, therefore I failed, and therefore I am a failure. And you just take on that identity. And it's because, I just had these thoughts screaming at me in my head, your marriage failed, so what makes you think that you can lead people or make an impact or do anything significant with your life if you can't even keep a marriage together? And so that's the place that I was in. And what was so interesting was that I found that I wasn't alone in that. Actually, when I was preparing for my remarriage, I really dove in and studied, and if we have time, we can talk more about that, but I actually read 16 books on marriage, divorce, and remarriage between my engagement and my wedding to my now husband, Barry. And we only had a 6-month engagement, so it was a lot of reading in a short period of time. Yeah. But what I found was I wasn't alone in that so many people, when they go through divorce, and specifically women, it's interesting, women take on that identity a lot of times even more or to a greater extent than men do, but that's what we feel is just this great sense of personal failure. And it was really interesting, and I tell this story in my book just real quickly. I was actually at a party for a friend of mine's daughter. She'd just gotten her black belt, so all of us we were together and we're celebrating this accomplishment in this young lady's life. And I remember another friend of mine was there, and he pulled me aside, and he knew what was going on, and so he said, hey, how are you doing? And, I was like, oh, I'm great, everything's fine. And he saw right through my false positive answer. And he said, he just looked at me, and with this compassion that it was so real and it was so tangible, he just said, I remember when I went through my divorce, the biggest thing I felt was like a failure. And I just started to cry because that was the first time I had talked to anybody about my divorce, first of all. It's kind of one of those things you try to keep hidden and just kind of pretend isn't going on, and you just kind of go about your life. And more than anything, it was the first time I felt like I wasn't alone and somebody understood me. And so it's this really bizarre reaction. It's a bizarre feeling, you kind of think, but that is very common.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, being in church, sometimes divorce, remarriage, they're considered controversial, taboo subjects. I know because personally, I have spoken about divorce. I've spoken about it in similar ways to actually what you're saying here. But how do you deal with that? How do you deal with the fact that some people might be judgmental towards people who have been through divorce?
Well, first of all, I did not handle that well myself. When I went through my divorce, because I was raised in that church environment where divorce was so taboo, remarriage was, this huge controversy. Is that even right? Is it okay? Is that allowed? Does the Bible speak against that? When I went through my divorce, I completely shut down. I isolated myself. This thought process that I had developed in my mind and I had convinced myself was that it was just better for everybody else if I wasn't around, because I was kind of a negative influence and I was the bad apple. And so I isolated myself and I ran away from, church groups. I ran away from small groups. I ran away from my leadership team. All these positive influences that I had in my life, I shut down and isolated myself from those, which I also think is a common response. But that's exactly what our enemy wants, right?
Right.
And so what I found in going through that is, there are always going to be people who just don't get it yet, who don't understand. And there are certainly going to still be people who are judgmental but it's not my responsibility to make those people understand. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. What I found when I was doing that study, when I was preparing for my remarriage, I read a book by Kenneth Hagin called Marriage, Divorce, and Remarriage. And he specifically talks in there, he really dives into Scripture and dissects the different Scripture. The question is, well, Jesus says one thing about marriage and divorce, and Paul says another, and what about this, and what about that? And different Scriptures in the New Testament seem to contradict themselves. And so he really breaks that down. It's really fascinating stuff. He breaks it down and he talks about in the different Scriptures when Jesus or Paul or whoever are talking to different groups of people. So in some instances, they're talking to the Jewish people who are sitting under and understanding and living in the Jewish culture and the Jewish law, and so that's their level of understanding. So he communicates in a way that's in line with the Jewish culture and their laws. And then in other circumstances, they're talking to the Gentiles. And so it's a completely different conversation. It's a completely different talk track. But what Kenneth Hagin breaks it down into is he says, it all comes down to the fact that we're all flawed people. We're living in a flawed world. We're all imperfect, and we all need grace. And so, absolutely, if you get divorced, is that something that God wants? No, he doesn't want people to get divorced because that hurts his people, and so that hurts him. And when his people are hurting each other, that's hurtful to him. But, if you find yourself in that situation, the best thing to do is extend grace to yourself, extend grace to other people. God is certainly extending grace to you. And what he says in the book and what I have come to believe is that, certainly he doesn't expect people to then stay single the rest of their life. Certainly he's not sending people straight to hell because they get remarried. You know what I mean? And so it was really good for me to study and understand those things from a biblical perspective. And then I knew my truth. You know what I mean? Like I knew the truth that I had learned and what I understood. And if other people hadn't studied those things or hadn't understood that yet, that was okay.
And so when you're talking about people's now what moments, why do you believe that most people never really get over them?
Oh, yes. Because they do the exact same thing that I did. And that is that people just run. They just run as fast and as hard and as far away from whatever that moment is in their life. And they just, and it's a coping mechanism. You're just trying to put your life back together and move on. And so actually, and I mentioned this in the book too, that the whole second part of my book is other people's now what stories. So it's me telling other people's stories about their now what moments that aren't divorce at all. It's military rejection and medical diagnoses and people going to prison, and that's their now what moment. And it was really difficult for me when I was thinking of people in my life and thinking of people that I could interview, certainly off the top of my head, I could think of all kinds of people who had been through now what moments, other people who had been through divorces. But it was really difficult for me to think of people who had actually dealt with emotionally and healthily have dealt with their now what moment and processed it and moved on in a healthy manner and have not just run away from it. Because, again, that's what I did initially. I just ran away. Like I said, you kind of pretend that it didn't happen. You just pick up your life and go on and do whatever you can do as fast as you can to put your life back together in some semblance of order. And it wasn't until 4 years later, 3.5 years later, when I got engaged to my husband, Barry, that everything kind of came up and hit me in the face. And I was like, oh, crap, like I'm not ready for remarriage at all. And I haven't dealt with my divorce in any way whatsoever. And I need to address that before I can even think about getting remarried. And most people, they just don't do that. They just keep running, and they look to fill up those pieces, those broken places, those empty places with whatever they can find, whether that's other relationships, that's jobs, that's accomplishments, moving across the country, anything that they can do and to try to fill that void and fill those gaps. Mm-hmm. And what I say in my book is, hey, it doesn't matter. Wherever you go, there you are. And whatever relationship that you're in, you're the one in that relationship. So until you deal with those things yourself, you're never going to be able to fully heal from those things.
Absolutely. And you talk about being able to turn passion and pain into purpose. How is a person able to do that?
Absolutely. That is the biggest blessing of this whole situation, because divorce sucks. I mean, it just sucks. And it derails every part of your life. Again, the biggest thing that I felt like was like a failure. So not only am I starting over emotionally and financially and relationally and all these things in my life, with my dreams, with my purpose, with what am I supposed to be doing in my life, I was starting from scratch. Because what I thought I was supposed to do now wasn't an option. Or didn't seem like an option. I didn't feel like that I could be used by God anymore, specifically in any type of ministry. And I feel, and what I have learned is that a lot of people find themselves in that same place after their now what moment. And what I have found to be true universally every single time is that God will never let your pain be purposeless. He'll never let the pain in your life go without being used, if you let him. And so, like, for example, I tell this story in my book. My friend, Leslie, was hit by a drunk driver. She wasn't drinking herself. She was just out at night, headed to a friend's house, whatever. And she got hit by a drunk driver, had to go through a year of rehabilitation, in a wheelchair for a year. She still today has glass in her face and her legs and walks with a limp. And, I mean, that's a pretty devastating, she's laying in a hospital bed going, God, why did this happen to me? I wasn't the one drinking, what the heck? And since then, she has been able to take that situation, and now she goes into different departments of transportation in her state, different school organizations, and she speaks about the real-life effects of drunk driving. And so she is using this painful moment, this painful circumstance that she went through in her life to now speak into other people's lives, to keep that from happening to other people. So she's able to use that pain for a very real, significant purpose. And it seems so obvious now when you look at that, like, oh, of course, that makes sense that she would do that because of what she had been through. But at the time when she was laying in the hospital bed going, God, what the heck, it didn't seem so obvious. And so that's, I think, where all of us are. And when I went through my divorce, of course, at first I didn't see how this situation could possibly be used for my good or God's glory or to help anybody else. But what I started to find is, when I started talking about my divorce with other people, when I started talking about what I went through with other people who were considering divorce, who had been through divorce also, or even just people going through completely unrelated things, people could start to feel, hey, I'm not alone. There's somebody else that's been through this, and wow, she gets this. And if God can do what he's done in her life after what she went through, then maybe he can do that for me. And it gives people hope. Yeah, and so that is exactly it. That is taking your pain and using it for purpose, in that God can always take whatever our situation is and use it to help and bless other people, to bring them hope, to let them know they're not alone. And I actually, in the back of the book, in chapter 10, there's actually an exercise, a worksheet that I have in there that people can brainstorm about their passions, their natural talents and abilities, and then their now what moment. And when you kind of diagram all those things together, you start to see overlapping themes emerge, and you start to see how those things can be used together for what is your purpose that God's calling you to. And it's really exciting stuff.
Absolutely. That is exciting. And it seems like your now what could actually be a transition into God bringing purpose back into your life. And I just think that's a very exciting thing. I thank you so much, Rachel Dawn, for being on our show. Can you tell our listeners where they can find you online and where they can find your book, Now What?
Yes, absolutely. So we've got a book website set up. It's www.nowwhatstory.com. It is going to be live. It'll be live by the time this airs, so we can just, put the address. So www.nowwhatstory.com is where you'll go to read about the book, to see advanced praise. There's a countdown to launch. There's places that you can buy it on there. Initially, we're going to be launching on Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com. It'll also be on Amazon overseas in Europe and their sister companies, and you can buy it in paperback and in Kindle or ebook versions. So that is that. And then if people want to connect with me, they can head on over to RachelDawnWright.com. But one of the things on the Now What Story website is there's a section for you to tell me your Now What story, and I want to hear it. I want to hear whatever situation that you've been through, because it might not be divorce. It's probably not divorce. Whatever that is that you've been through, there's a questionnaire that'll help you kind of work through what you've been through, the different things that you felt, and start to see how God can use that for your purpose. And so fill that out. I want to hear your story, and I can't wait to connect with you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Rachel Dawn, for being on the Joe and Rosa show today.
Thank you.